Welcome back to the channel. These stories are meant for late nights, quiet rooms, and headphones on. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin the first story. These videos are based on real events, experiences, and accounts. However, all names, locations, and identifying details have been deliberately changed to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. Viewer discretion is advised. It had been nearly a year since I'd started my late-night shift at the gas station on the edge of Cedar Ridge, a small town that barely registered on most maps. The place was out of the way, nestled between the highway and a stretch of dense forest, which made it perfect for the owner, Mr. Harlan, to pay minimal attention to security. Cameras were few and far between, and the alarm system had more quirks than I could count. I didn't mind, though. The job was easy, almost absurdly so. Most nights, the only company I had was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional passing car. The only real challenge wasn't the job itself, it was Mr. Harlan. He had the attention span of a squirrel. Arguments we had would reset every day, cycling endlessly over trivial things. The price of candy bars, the arrangement of shelves, whether the coffee machine needed a new filter. I often joked to myself that he might forget his own name if I reminded him too frequently. But I learned early on that his forgetfulness didn't excuse the fact that I was stuck working nights in a near-empty store. One Thursday night, I remember it was a Thursday because the smell of wet leaves outside reminded me of fall, I was leaning against the counter, half asleep with a magazine in my hand. Time at night had a strange quality in that store. The hours melted together, a gray smear between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. I had gotten so used to the faint buzz of the lights above me that it became almost invisible, background noise that my brain ignored entirely. That's why when the front door chimed, it hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked up, startled, and saw him. A man in his early 30s, tall, muscular, dressed in dark, worn clothing, standing in the doorway. At first, I assumed he had been in a fight because he was covered head to toe in what I immediately recognized as blood. There were streaks across his arms, a splash across his chest, and dark rivulets running down his face. My mind stalled, trying to rationalize it as something else. Paint, ketchup, but deep down I knew the truth. What froze me in place wasn't just the blood, it was the eyes. Empty, blank, like he was staring at me through a mask of nothingness. Despite the gore plastered across him, he moved with the calmness of someone who had just walked into a store to buy a pack of gum. There was no panic, no urgency, no recognition that the world around him had any meaning at all. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low, almost casual. "It's not mine." I couldn't breathe. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. I nodded dumbly, burying my face in my magazine, hoping that pretending everything was normal would somehow make him disappear. He moved through the aisles methodically, picking up random items as if nothing about the scene defied logic. I rang him up, hands shaking, eyes glued to the register, careful not to meet his gaze. He paid in cash and left as quietly as he had come, the bell on the door chiming a deathly note behind him. I immediately grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped it. I tried to explain what I saw, describing him as best I could while my adrenaline threatened to overwhelm me. The dispatcher asked questions, and I was mid-sentence when the door chimed again. My stomach dropped. It wasn't another customer. It was him. He stormed toward the counter, anger radiating off him like heat from a fire. His eyes, once blank, were now sharp and furious. "Did you call the cops?" he demanded. I shook my head, but he didn't believe me. His voice rose, full of venom and accusation. Before I could react, he launched across the counter. My last clear thought was disbelief. How could someone move that fast? In less than 2 seconds, he had pinned me down, hands wrapped around my neck. I clawed, kicked, bit, anything to survive. My magazine was smeared with a mix of his blood and mine. Then, in a final act of desperation, I screamed, "I have a gun!" I didn't, of course, but the bluff worked. His grip loosened, and he bolted out the door. I lay on the floor gasping, every part of me shaking, until I heard his car roar away. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found me covered in blood, but there was no sign of him, no news reports, no leads. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. I thought that might have been the end. That terror, raw and immediate, left me cautious but determined to keep working. A few months passed, and I returned to Cedar Ridge Station, mostly because it was the only job I could get quickly and I needed the money. I convinced myself that the first night had been a freak incident, a single encounter with a man who had problems I couldn't hope to understand. Then he returned. It was another Thursday night, eerily similar to the first. I was alone, staring at the ceiling, watching the fluorescent lights flicker lazily. The front door chimed and my stomach dropped. This time, he wasn't in blood-stained clothes. He wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit that screamed wealth and control. There was no browsing of aisles, no hesitation. He walked straight to me, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a photograph. I froze. I knew immediately what it was. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Him, from that night. Blood, rage, everything I had hoped to forget. He didn't speak at first. He simply stared, as if weighing my very soul. Then, in a voice roughened by cigarettes, he asked, "Have you seen this man?" I swallowed hard and lied, saying no. My gut screamed to deny everything, to avoid any entanglement. He said nothing, just studied me, eyes calculating as if he could see straight through the lie. After what felt like eternity, he tucked the photo away and moved toward the door, but before leaving, he turned and said softly, "I know you're lying." That was it. He left, and the night returned to its uneasy silence. I didn't call the police. I wasn't sure what I could even say, and the memory of the last encounter left me with a deep-rooted fear of authorities. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing a silver SUV everywhere. Outside the store, the grocery down the street, parked near my apartment. I was convinced he was following me, tracking me, aware of every move I made. My paranoia was constant, gnawing at my peace of mind. The breaking point came a few weeks later. I was asleep in my apartment, exhausted after a long job. A sound jolted me awake. My first thought wasn't fear, it was action. I grabbed the bat I kept under my bed and raced into the living room. The house was empty. Then I noticed it. A rock, the size of a fist resting among shards of broken glass. I knew immediately what it meant. He had been here. I didn't hesitate. The next day, I quit. I packed what I could, found a new apartment in a neighboring town, and moved. I told myself that distancing myself from the gas station, from Cedar Ridge, would erase the danger. And for a while, it seemed to work. But the memory of those nights never left me. The blood, the rage, the calculated stare, it haunted my dreams. And every time I saw a silver SUV, a chill ran down my spine. I had no idea who he was, why he had targeted me, or what connection he had to that first terrifying night. All I knew was that somewhere out there, he was waiting, watching, and the thought of that was enough to make my hands shake even years later. I thought I was safe in my new apartment for a while. Cedar Ridge was behind me, the gas station was behind me, and that silver SUV was nowhere in sight. I had convinced myself that I had escaped, that quitting the job and moving a few towns over had ended it all. For a while, life settled into a sort of uneasy normalcy. I went to work during the day, kept my head down, and tried not to think about the past. But the universe has a funny way of reminding you that nothing truly goes away. It happened late one night, about 8 months after the last incident. I had been on the road for hours, driving back from a job site 3 hours out of state. The day had been brutal. I was exhausted, my body sore, and my eyelids heavy with fatigue. I hadn't had enough caffeine to keep myself alert, and the monotony of the highway was starting to play tricks on my brain. My truck was old, rattly, and without any modern driver assistance, so I knew I had to be extra careful. About 45 minutes into the drive, I felt my eyelids droop in a way that made it nearly impossible to keep focus. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but I realized I needed a break. I saw a small gas station off the exit and pulled in. It was empty except for a couple of cars that had since left. I filled my tank, smoked a cigarette, and debated whether to push on or take a short nap. The logical choice won. I parked in the far corner of the lot, turned off the engine, and closed my eyes. Sleep took me almost instantly, the exhaustion finally winning over every cautionary thought. When I woke, my alarm felt like it had barely gone off before I opened my eyes. I wasn't fully rested, but I was alert enough to continue the drive. I pulled back onto the highway, grateful for the empty roads. The first 20 minutes went smoothly. I let my mind drift a bit, riding on muscle memory. I wasn't falling asleep exactly, but I was dangerously close to autopilot. That's when I heard it, a faint thumping from the back of the truck. At first, I assumed it was a tool rolling around in the bed, but it didn't stop. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, almost taunting. I turned to look, but the darkness obscured everything. I checked the truck bed quickly, but nothing had shifted. I cursed under my breath, turned the radio up, and tried to ignore it. For 10 minutes, the sound vanished, replaced by the steady hum of tires on asphalt. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. Then, out of nowhere, a deafening crack reverberated from behind me. Glass shattered. My stomach dropped. My first instinct was terror, pure and primal. I slammed on the brakes, the truck fishtailing as I tried to regain control. I looked in the rearview mirror and my blood ran cold. There, in the bed of my truck, was a man. Dark hoodie, obscured face, hands swinging wildly as he struck the reinforced glass divider separating the cab from the bed. He wasn't just trying to make noise, he was trying to kill me. The realization hit with a sickening force. My vehicle swerved dangerously, almost tipping, as I fought to regain control. I barely managed to stabilize the truck, lungs heaving, heart pounding in my ears. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Who was this? How had he gotten there without me noticing when I'd parked and slept? The possibilities were horrifying. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip the wheel. Adrenaline surged, and for a moment I acted instinctively. I unbuckled my seatbelt and jumped out, running toward the truck bed. The man in the hoodie scrambled out as well, landing on the pavement and bolting toward the tree line on the side of the highway. My fight or flight reflex urged me to chase him, but I quickly realized how foolish that would be. Darkness stretched endlessly, and I had no idea what weapons, if any, he carried. I had to survive. I retreated, throwing myself back into the cab and slamming the door. Shaking violently, I drove a short distance and pulled over to inspect the truck. The glass divider was shattered, cracked, spiderwebbed across its surface, but it hadn't given way completely. That was the only relief I could cling to. I climbed into the bag carefully, trying to determine what he had been using. My stomach twisted when I saw it. A black trash bag, soaked, heavy, and emitting a putrid stench. My stomach lurched as I realized it smelled like rotting meat. Without thinking twice, I grabbed it and hurled it into the nearby trees. I couldn't linger. I got back into the cab and drove, keeping my eyes constantly on the tree line for any sign of movement. My hands were coated in the red liquid from the bag, and I could feel it drying, clinging to my skin like a sick reminder of what had happened. I rubbed my hands on my jeans, trying to cleanse them mentally, if not physically. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting him to reappear. My nerves were shredded, my body tense from hours of fear and adrenaline. When I finally reached my apartment, I parked, locked the doors, and didn't move for a long time. My mind replayed every second of the encounter, trying to make sense of it. It was clear to me then that he had climbed into the truck bed while I was asleep at the gas station. He had lain flat, waiting, like a predator biding his time. The thought made my skin crawl. He could have been there for over an hour, following me without me ever knowing. My truck, my safe space, had been violated completely. I hadn't just been stalked. Someone had put themselves in a position to end my life, and I had barely escaped. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone. The incident was locked away, a secret I carried like a scar. I had my glass repaired quietly, paid a friend to fix it without asking questions, and tried to bury the memory. But even weeks later, every time I heard a sound behind me or caught a glimpse of a dark figure at night, my heart would race uncontrollably. I wasn't the same person I had been before that night. The gas station, the blood-covered man, the suited stranger, the silver SUV, the trash bag, and the truck bed, they weren't random events. They were threads in a chain that had targeted me, and I was powerless to stop them. That realization stayed with me for months. I moved again after that, this time far enough away that I told myself I could finally escape. But the fear never truly left. It lingered in the back of my mind, subtle and unrelenting. Every drive alone late at night, every unfamiliar knock at my door triggered memories of those nights. I never fully understood why someone had fixated on me. Had I been in the wrong place at the wrong time? Was it a case of mistaken connection, or had I simply stumbled into the orbit of someone's capacity for violence and obsession was beyond comprehension? Years have passed since that night. I've built a life elsewhere, far removed from Cedar Ridge, far removed from gas stations, strangers, and SUVs that follow you silently through the night. I have friends, routines, and a sense of safety, or at least as much as anyone can have. But when I drive alone late at night, or when I wake to a sound outside my window, I can't help but relive those hours of pure, unfiltered terror. I'll never know why I was chosen, why this man hunted me, or how close I truly came to death. All I know is that once you've stared into the eyes of someone who doesn't see you as human, someone who moves through the world like a predator, a piece of your innocence is gone forever. And for me, that piece was stolen during those long, terrible nights at the gas station and on that lonely stretch of highway. Every time I think back, I shiver, not because of imagination, but because I know with unshakable certainty that he is out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. My name is Alex Harper, and for a while I worked the night shift at a gas station called Maplewood Mart, sitting all alone in a tiny building on the outskirts of a town that barely existed on any map. This was back when gas stations didn't have cameras covering every square inch, and the owner, Mr. Penrose, made sure to keep it that way because installing security was expensive and he was tight with his money. For me, the job was easy. Too easy, really. I'd sit behind the counter from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., reading magazines, sipping cheap coffee, and fending off boredom. The only challenge was Mr. Penrose himself, who had the memory of a goldfish. Arguments about pricing or cleaning schedules repeated weekly, and it was exhausting, but in a way predictable. Most nights were uneventful. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead became a lullaby of sorts, lulling me into a numb, almost hypnotic state. That's why the sound of the door chime one night jolted me awake in a way I hadn't experienced before. I looked up and my heart almost stopped. A man had walked in. He was tall, well-built, and probably in his mid-30s. His presence alone wasn't alarming. What was alarming was the fact that he was drenched in blood. It covered his face, arms, and chest in thick streaks and splatters, so vivid that it looked like a grotesque work of art. At first, I thought maybe it was some kind of theatrical makeup or red paint, but the way it soaked into his clothes and skin told a different story. My gaze traveled to his eyes and I froze. There was nothing there. No recognition, no emotion, no hint of humanity. Just emptiness. He strolled casually through the aisles, grabbed a few random items, and approached the counter. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. His eyes seemed to drill into me, holding my attention against my will. I tried to act normal, trying to hide the shaking in my hands. When he spoke, it was calm, almost friendly. "Don't worry, it's not my blood," he said. Not helpful, not even close. My brain screamed at me that this man was dangerous, that calling the police was necessary, but I forced myself to stay composed. I rang up his items without making eye contact, handing him change with trembling fingers. He paid, said nothing else, and left as quietly as he had arrived. I exhaled, relief washing over me, but it was fleeting. As soon as I heard a car start in the lot outside, I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, describing the situation as best as I could. Mid-conversation with the dispatcher, the door chimed again. My stomach dropped. He was back. The same man, looking angrier this time. He stormed up to the counter, demanding to know if I had called the police. I denied it, hoping my lie would protect me, but he wasn't convinced. His voice rose, and suddenly those empty eyes were filled with fury. Before I could react, he leapt across the counter and pinned me to the floor. His hands were on my throat in seconds. I thrashed, kicked, and bit, anything to survive. My thoughts spun wildly, adrenaline surging, until I made a desperate bluff. I claimed I had a gun. I wasn't armed, but the gamble worked. He released me, scrambled toward the door, and vanished into the night. I stayed on the floor, covered in his blood, or someone else's, for what felt like hours. The police came, but they found nothing. There was no trace of him, no report filed, no explanation. The town was too small, the evidence too thin. I was left with my terror and the gnawing sense that I'd glimpsed something utterly unexplainable. I tried to move on. I convinced myself that incident was a one-time nightmare, but months later, something even stranger happened. I was still working at Maplewood Mart, probably my first mistake. One late night, a man walked in wearing a tailored dark gray suit, impeccably clean, entirely out of place in our tiny rural gas station. He didn't browse or speak. He walked straight up to the counter and produced a photograph. I looked down and froze. The photo showed the blood-covered man from that first terrifying night. My stomach dropped. The suited man didn't say a word at first. He simply stared, watching me. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, he asked if I had ever seen the man before. My instincts screamed at me to lie. I did, and I maintained it as convincingly as I could. The pause that followed was unbearable. Then, without a word, he picked up the photo and left, but not before telling me, "I know you're lying." After that, life became a tense blur. I began noticing a silver USV appearing everywhere I went, parked across the street during day shifts, outside the grocery store I visited, even near my apartment. I wasn't paranoid. I had a reason to be. He had found me. Weeks later, it escalated again. I was awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of glass shattering. My apartment was small, but I ran through each room and found nothing, except a rock sitting in the middle of my living room floor surrounded by broken shards. No note, no explanation, just a message I instinctively understood. I had been warned. I quit my job the next day. I moved to a new apartment a few towns over. For the first time in months, I felt some semblance of peace. The silver USV disappeared. Weeks passed without incident. I managed to rebuild some normalcy, convincing myself that the threats had ended. But the shadow of that night lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about how he had tracked me, how the blood-covered man had come so close to ending my life, and how the suited man had known so much. My mind replayed the events endlessly. Sleep was never quite safe. Every creak of a floorboard or distant engine set my nerves on edge. I survived, yes, but the memory left a permanent scar, a reminder that the world could harbor people capable of planning and executing terror without warning or reason. Even now, I think about Maplewood Mart, the blood-streaked man, the suited stranger, and the silver USV. I don't have answers, and I don't think I ever will, but the fear and the lessons it taught me about vigilance, instinct, and survival are with me every day. I know I can never forget those nights, because they were not just terrifying, they were a glimpse into something deeply human and disturbingly cruel, something I was lucky to survive. It had been nearly 3 weeks since I moved to Havenwood. a small, almost sleepy town a couple of counties over from where Maplewood Mart had been. I thought that by putting some distance between myself and that nightmare, I could finally find peace. I found a modest apartment on the edge of town, far enough from main streets to feel safe, but close enough to grocery stores and gas stations to feel normal. I got a new job at a 24-hour convenience store called Pine Ridge Stop, but I insisted on day shifts for a while just to let my nerves settle. I was trying to rebuild my life cautiously, one step at a time. Then one evening, after a long day, I had to make the drive back from a client site in a neighboring county. The day had been brutal. 8 hours of moving heavy equipment, dealing with uncooperative weather, and barely enough caffeine to keep my eyelids from drooping. By the time I got back on the highway, it was past 10 and exhaustion was pressing on me like a physical weight. My old truck, a beat-up 2012 model I had bought used, didn't have lane assist or any of the newer safety features, which meant I had to be fully alert for the 3-hour drive home. I knew from experience that my body would betray me if I tried to push it too far, so I kept glancing at the fuel gauge and planning my pit stops carefully. About 45 minutes into the drive, I realized my body was giving in. My eyelids fluttered involuntarily, and I had to physically shake my head to keep them open. I spotted a small gas station sign glimmering in the darkness, a place that looked almost deserted. My instinct told me to keep going, but my body said no. I pulled in, filled the tank, lit a cigarette, and debated my next move. I had over 2 hours left, and I knew I would never make it without rest, so I decided to take a quick nap in the corner of the lot, leaving the engine running, figuring it would be safe enough for a couple of hours. I was out almost instantly. When my alarm went off, it felt like I had blinked and time had skipped an hour. My body was more awake, more alert, but I still had that lingering fatigue clawing at me. I pulled back onto the highway and drove cautiously. The first 20 minutes passed without incident. The road was empty, the radio playing faint background noise, letting me slip into a semi-autopilot mode. I was zoning out, not asleep, but barely conscious, letting the motions of driving take over while my mind wandered. Then I heard it, a faint thumping sound coming from behind me. My first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was some loose tool or piece of equipment shifting in the back of the truck. I adjusted the AC to hear better, turning up the volume slightly, but the sound persisted. It was irregular, heavy, deliberate, not like the natural clatter of objects in the truck bed. My heart rate increased. Something was wrong. I slammed my hand against the hood of the truck out of frustration, and for a brief moment, the thumping stopped. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Within 10 minutes, a deafening crack erupted directly from behind, like someone had thrown a heavy object against the rear window. My blood ran cold. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, skidding slightly, heart pounding in my chest. I turned to look and nearly lost control of the vehicle. There, crouched in the back of my truck, was a man. His movements were frantic and violent, and he was pounding on the glass dividers separating the truck bed from the cab. The sound echoed in the empty highway like some wild, untamed animal. I swerved violently, trying to shake him off, but every movement seemed to provoke him further. Adrenaline surged through me, mixed with paralyzing fear. I genuinely thought I was going to flip the truck, or worse, that he would break through and reach me. When the truck finally lurched to a stop, I unbuckled my seatbelt and jumped out. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I could feel the sweat and grime of hours on the road slick against my skin. The man in the truck bed didn't seem to notice my movements at first. Then, spotting me, he leapt out in a fluid motion and bolted toward the tree line bordering the highway. I started to follow for a few seconds, but the darkness, the unknown terrain, and my exhaustion made me realize chasing him was madness. I stopped, panting, and watched as he vanished into the shadows. I returned to the truck, my pulse still racing. The rear window divider was cracked and splintered. One more forceful hit and it would have shattered entirely. I climbed into the bed cautiously to inspect what he had been using, and that's when I saw it. A tightly wrapped trash bag, small, about the size of 2 fists, wet to the touch, and emitting a rotten smell. I recoiled instinctively, realizing this was something far worse than a mere tool or rock. Without thinking twice, I hurled it into the tree line, gagging at the stench and feeling the red-tinged residue smear over my hands. I rubbed my jeans over them as I got back into the cab, starting the engine and driving away as fast as I dared. For the rest of the drive home, my mind replayed the incident over and over. It didn't make sense. How had he gotten into the truck bed while I slept at the gas station? How had he remained completely still, hidden from my peripheral vision while I drove for nearly an hour? I knew the answer was horrifyingly simple. He had planned it. Every step, every movement had been calculated. That realization left a cold pit in my stomach. I didn't involve the police. After my previous experiences, I knew they wouldn't take me seriously without evidence, and I couldn't risk escalating the situation further. Instead, I cleaned the truck as best as I could, masking the faint red stains, and kept the encounter to myself. Weeks passed, but the paranoia never did. Every shadow on the road, every unfamiliar car that drove past set my nerves on edge. Sleep became fitful, and every stop I made on the highway was now fraught with anxiety. I couldn't shake the fear that he might strike again, and I realized the truth. He wasn't just targeting me randomly. He had planned it, chosen me specifically, and knew exactly how to manipulate the circumstances to terrify me. Months later, I changed trucks. I installed a hard bed cover, upgraded my locks, and avoided driving alone at night whenever possible. I moved further from Havenwood, eventually settling in Ridgevale, a quiet town with minimal traffic and even fewer opportunities for strangers to sneak up on me. Life began to regain a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of that night, the man in the truck bed, and the stench of that bag never faded. It was etched into my mind, a reminder of how quickly ordinary nights could turn into absolute terror. Even today, I replay those hours in my head, wondering how close I had come to disaster. I think about the silver SUV from Maplewood, the suited man, the bloodied figure, and the intruder in the back of my truck. I try to piece together any connection between them, any reason for this string of harassment and stalking. But there is none. None that I can understand, and none that anyone else seems to know. The fear, the preparation, the dread, it was all part of a deliberate plan I was never meant to survive, yet I did. The most chilling part isn't just the encounters themselves. It's the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had taken an interest in my life, had studied my routines, had anticipated my reactions. They knew exactly when and how to terrify me, and they did it without remorse. It taught me something I hadn't known before. Some people do not act out of reason, motive, or justice. Some act simply because they can, because they find power and terror in controlling someone else's fear. I eventually returned to work at night, but only under strict safety measures. Cameras, locks, alarms, anything to regain control over my environment. Every time I step onto a highway at night now, I check the rearview mirror more than necessary, scan every car in the lot before stopping, and always carry a way to defend myself. The lesson is burned into me. Vigilance is no longer optional. Despite everything, I survive. I survived the bloodied man, the suited observer, the stalking SUV, and the intruder in the back of my truck. Each encounter changed me, taught me to value awareness, and instilled a kind of resilience that is hard to explain. I know the events I went through could break someone. They could have ended me at no number of points. But here I am, alive, cautious, and aware. I still think about those nights, the empty eyes of the first man, the cold stare of the suited stranger, and the primal violence of the intruder. And though I try not to dwell on them, sometimes the memory hits me when I least expect it. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the thump of something shifting behind me, the sudden crash of glass. Those triggers are reminders that some dangers are invisible, that the world holds horrors that cannot be explained, only survived. And that is how I live now. Alert, careful, wary, and always aware that the world is not as safe as it seems. The silver SUV, the blood, the faceless menace in the back of my truck, they are gone, but the imprint remains. Every late night, every empty highway, every shadow in the corner of my eye reminds me, some stories don't end. They simply continue in the memory and in the cautious steps of those who lived to tell them. It was just past midnight when Eli Mercer pulled into the parking lot of Silver Pines Auto, a small 24-hour service station tucked between two stretches of dense forest on the outskirts of Ashwood Valley. Eli had been on the road for nearly 4 hours hauling equipment for a job site nearly 3 counties away. The drive had been monotonous and exhausting, and despite a few strong cups of coffee, his body was beginning to rebel. His eyelids felt like lead, and every blink threatened to put him straight into sleep. Silver Pines Auto wasn't much to look at, just a single gas pump island, a dimly lit convenience store, and a cracked asphalt lot with enough space for maybe 10 cars. Eli parked in the far corner, away from the flickering overhead lights, hoping the slight distance would offer some peace as he rested. He shut off the engine, stepped out, and inhaled the cool night air. The forest surrounding the lot rustled faintly, leaves whispering under the wind. It was eerily quiet, but the stillness offered him a strange comfort. He filled the tank, lit a cigarette, and debated whether to push on or rest. He knew he couldn't make the final 2 hours without a break, so he decided to nap for a short while, hoping a few minutes would restore enough alertness to finish the drive safely. Eli reclined in the driver's seat, the sound of the engine ticking down providing a lullaby he desperately needed. Within moments, exhaustion claimed him. When he awoke, it felt like he had blinked once and the world had shifted. His phone clock read 1:45 a.m. and the lot was empty now, save for his truck. He rubbed his eyes and stretched, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. Reassured by the emptiness, he started the engine and slowly pulled onto the highway. The first 15 minutes were uneventful. The night was deep, the road deserted, and the radio playing faintly in the background was enough to stave off the creeping drowsiness. Eli's mind began to wander in that semi-conscious autopilot state where the highway seemed endless and time barely existed. But then he noticed it, a faint, irregular thumping from the back of the truck. At first, he tried to ignore it, blaming shifting tools or a piece of equipment sliding against the bed. The sound was soft but deliberate, unlike any ordinary object moving on its own. His pulse quickened. He adjusted the AC, trying to hear better. The thumping continued, rhythmic now, deliberate, heavy, impossible to ignore. Eli's stomach turned. It didn't make sense. The bed of the truck had been empty, save for a few scattered items secured by straps. Yet something was moving back there. He slammed his hand against the hood in frustration, and for a brief moment the thumping stopped. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Within minutes, a loud, sharp crack erupted directly behind him. It sounded like someone had smashed a heavy object against the rear window. Eli's stomach dropped. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, and spun around to see what had caused the noise. What he saw nearly froze him in place. There, crouched in the truck bed, was a man. His movements were violent, frantic, and impossible to predict. He pounded on the glass divider with the intensity of someone possessed, each strike reverberating through the cab like the pulse of a drum. Eli's hands gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled, as his mind raced. He swerved, trying to shake the man off, but the motion seemed to provoke him further. The man's silhouette was hunched, agile, and terrifyingly strong, every movement designed to intimidate. For a moment, he genuinely believed the glass would give way. He was trapped between fear and instinct, knowing that any sudden movement could mean disaster. The highway stretched endlessly in front of him, but the presence of that man behind made every mile seem like a knife edge. Finally, Eli brought the truck to a halt, heart hammering, and unbelted his seatbelt. Sweat slicked his hair to his forehead, and his legs felt like jelly. Adrenaline surged as he climbed out cautiously, every sense screaming that he was in a life-or-death situation. The man in the truck bed froze for a second, then leapt out and bolted toward the tree line lining the highway. The darkness swallowed him almost instantly. Eli hesitated, his instincts torn between chasing and staying put. He realized immediately that pursuit was foolish. The terrain was unknown, pitch black, and he had no way to anticipate an attack. He backed away, giving the man space, and watched until he disappeared entirely. Turning back to the truck, his eyes fell on the glass divider. Cracks radiated across the surface, spiderwebbing in a way that told him one more forceful strike would have shattered it completely. Trembling, he climbed into the bed cautiously to investigate the object the man had been using. That's when he saw it. A small, tightly wrapped trash bag, roughly the size of 2 fists, wet to the touch and exuding a stench so vile it made him gag. The smell was unmistakable. Something had rotted inside, something organic and foul. He recoiled, unable to comprehend why anyone would leave such a thing in his truck. Acting purely on instinct, he flung it into the forest, hoping the shadows would swallow it. Eli climbed back into the cab, wiped his hands on his jeans, and started the engine, trembling as he drove away. The road felt impossibly long, every shadow and sound magnified by his fear. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man somehow return. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had someone gained access to the truck bed without him noticing? How had they remained completely still while he drove for nearly an hour? The answer was terrifyingly simple. It had been planned. Every movement, every thump, every crack was deliberate. Over the next few days, Eli avoided long drives alone. He upgraded the locks on his truck, bought a bed cover, and installed a small camera system he could monitor from the cab. Every time he drove, he checked mirrors obsessively, scanned empty parking lots, and double-checked his surroundings. Even the faintest sound behind him made his heart race, and every unfamiliar vehicle triggered a flood of paranoia. He knew he was being cautious, but he also knew it wasn't an overreaction. Someone had targeted him, had stalked him, and had the power to terrorize him at will. Work became a battleground of nerves. He avoided closing shifts for a while, fearing another encounter. Every night he double-checked the doors, the cameras, and even his personal belongings. He couldn't trust the world outside, not after what had happened. Even when friends reassured him that it was likely a random person, a one-time threat, he couldn't shake the sensation that it was personal. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create fear in his life, and the memory of that small trash bag, coated in something unholy, haunted him more than any physical assault ever could. Months passed, and Eli slowly regained a sense of routine. He began taking longer drives again, but only with precautions. Phone fully charged, friends alerted to his route, and emergency kit always in the cab. But even with safety measures, he knew the fear would never fully leave. Some nights, the thumping in the back of his truck would replay in his mind, synchronized with the night winds that rattled the windows of his apartment. Every shadow, every sound, even in broad daylight, could trigger the memory of that man pounding at the glass, relentless and invisible until the very moment he struck. What terrified Eli most wasn't just the physical encounter. It was the understanding that someone, somewhere, had taken an active interest in his life. They had studied him, understood his habits, and exploited the smallest lapse in vigilance. The knowledge that a stranger could exercise that much control over another person's environment left a lingering dread that no rational explanation could erase. It was the embodiment of helplessness, the certainty that no matter how careful he was, the potential for terror always existed. Despite the lingering fear, Eli survived. He survived the night at Silver Pines, survived the man in the truck bed, and survived the months of paranoia that followed. Every step he took afterwards was deliberate, cautious, measured. The encounter had changed him irrevocably. He knew the world contained dangers that couldn't always be predicted, that some people acted with no motive other than the power to frighten, and ordinary nights could, in an instant, descend into absolute horror. The incident remained burned into his memory, a silent specter accompanying him on every journey. It reminded him that survival often depended less on luck and more on vigilance, preparation, and respect for the unseen. Every shadow on the road, every unfamiliar noise, even a slight shift in a darkened lot triggered that old instinctual fear. And yet, amidst all the terror, there was a strange resilience that had emerged. Eli had faced something beyond comprehension, and he had come out alive. That fact, small as it was, gave him a fragile sense of control in a world that had, for one night at least, felt completely out of control. Eli tried to convince himself that the worst was over. Months had passed since the incident on the highway, and the truck had long been repaired, the shattered divider replaced, the strange trash bag discarded and forgotten. He had moved on with work, resumed long drives, and convinced himself that whoever had attacked him in the truck bed was gone for good. But deep down, he knew better. Some part of him remained on edge, bracing for the next encounter, the next inexplicable act of terror that would shatter the fragile sense of normalcy he had rebuilt. It was a rainy evening in late October when he felt it. The storm had rolled in quickly, winds rattling the windows of his apartment in Ashwood Valley, rain hammering the roof like an unrelenting drum. Eli had stayed late at the construction site again, only just making it home before the worst of the storm hit. The streetlights flickered as he parked in his building's small lot, the reflection of the puddles creating an eerie shimmer across the asphalt. He stepped out, gripping his coat tighter, and moved briskly to the door. Something about the night felt off. Not just the storm, but a weight pressing against him, something unseen and looming. Inside, the apartment was dark, except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the living room. Eli dropped his bag by the door, shaken slightly by the sudden sound of a thud against the window. His stomach lurched. One, then another, lighter, but deliberate, like a fist tapping a slow warning. He froze. For a moment, he convinced himself it was just debris blown in the wind, but when the third thud echoed against the glass, his instincts screamed at him that this was no ordinary storm. Heart racing, he moved cautiously to the window. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the shadows outside. Nothing. Just the empty street and the dark shapes of trees bending in the wind. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His mind flashed back to that night on the highway, to the pounding on the glass divider, to the smell of that wet, rotting bag. And then he noticed it. A shadow moving across the far end of the lot. A figure just standing there, watching. Eli's pulse hammered in his chest as he backed away from the window. Whoever it was, they knew he was home. They had found him. Panic and adrenaline coursed through him in equal measure. He considered calling the police, but his previous encounters had taught him caution. He couldn't be sure what he was dealing with. If the person was the same man or someone connected, they might act violently if they knew authorities were involved. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. The figure remained outside, just beyond the dim glow of the parking lot lights. It wasn't moving closer, but it wasn't leaving either. It was as if they were waiting, testing him. Eli's mind raced. He retrieved his baseball bat from under the bed, the only weapon he had readily available, and moved to the living room, keeping the lights low. He couldn't let them see him, but he needed a vantage point. From the corner of the room, he could see the figure more clearly now. The rain had soaked them completely, their dark hoodie plastered to their frame, but their posture was unnervingly calm. No frantic movement, no visible weapon, just a presence that radiated menace. Time stretched. The storm raged outside, each crash of thunder amplifying the tension. Eli considered making a run for his car, but something about the figure gave him pause. This wasn't a random act of burglary or vandalism. It was personal. They knew him. They had come for him. And that thought was worse than any storm, any shadow, any threat he had faced before. Suddenly, a metallic scrape echoed from the far side of the apartment. The figure had moved closer, somehow traversing the lot without being detected, and now something large and solid scraped against the exterior wall. Eli's hands shook violently around the bat. He realized they weren't just outside, they were preparing to enter. He needed to act. Quietly, he edged toward the door, heart in his throat, every nerve screaming. He unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door just enough to peer outside. The lot was empty again, just rain and shadows. Relief washed over him for a second, too soon. A dark van, previously unnoticed, was now parked along the side street, highlights off, engine running. And in the back, something shifted. He caught the briefest glimpse of movement and a cold realization hit him. The terror wasn't ending tonight. It was about to escalate. Eli stepped back inside, his mind racing. He needed to barricade the door, reinforce the windows, do anything to buy time. He pushed the couch against the front door, stacked chairs, anything to delay an entry. Every step was careful, deliberate. He couldn't afford mistakes. And then he heard it. A faint, wet thud from the back window. Someone was climbing. He whipped around, bat raised, and caught sight of a hooded figure hoisting themselves over the ledge, arms moving with deadly precision. The attack was instantaneous. The figure landed in a crouch, silently, almost inhumanly. Eli swung the bat, connecting with the shoulder, but the strike barely slowed them. They lunged, knocking him off balance, and chaos erupted. Eli fought with everything he had, slamming, pushing, swinging, desperate for survival. The figure moved with terrifying speed and coordination, anticipating his every move. Blood, sweat, and rain mingled as the struggle continued, the storm outside now a mere soundtrack to a far more immediate horror. Eli's eyes fell on a second object lying near the broken window, another trash bag, damp, smeared with something dark, stinking, horrifying. His stomach turned violently. The figure had brought it with them, the same sick ritual, the same grotesque taunting from months before. He realized then the pattern. This was not just about physical harm. It was about fear, control, terrorizing him in ways that would linger long after the attack ended. Summoning every ounce of courage, Eli forced the figure back toward the broken window. One final swing, one final push, and they stumbled, falling partially outside. Without hesitation, Eli bolted, lunging at the front door and screaming for help. The van's engine roared to life, tires skidding against wet asphalt, but the figure inside seemed to hesitate, as if caught between following him and some unknown directive. In that hesitation, Eli ran, sprinting down the stairs, through the hallway, and into the stormy night. The police arrived minutes later, alerted by a frantic neighbor who had heard the struggle. The van was gone, the lot empty, the apartment quiet again. Officers searched for hours but found nothing. No trace of the hooded figure, no signs of forced entry beyond the obvious broken glass, and no indication of what had been in the trash bag. Eli gave his statement, shaking violently, but even as he spoke, he knew it would do little to provide answers. Whoever had targeted him had vanished into the night, leaving only fear in their wake. In the weeks that followed, Eli relocated again, this time a distant city far removed from Ashwood Valley. He changed jobs, changed routines, and installed every conceivable security measure in his new apartment. Cameras, locks, alarms, nothing was left to chance. Yet even with these precautions, the memories haunted him. Shadows moving along the road, the rhythmic pounding on glass, the stink of that unknown object. It was impossible to forget. Each sound, each flicker of movement could trigger the old fear in an instant. And then one rainy night, a familiar chill settled over him. Walking to his car after work, he noticed a vehicle parked across the street, a silver SUV gleaming wet under the streetlights. For a split second, his mind froze. Could it be? Could the person who had hunted him months ago have tracked him even here? He forced himself to look away, to dismiss the irrationality, but a part of him knew better. Some fears, once awakened, never truly sleep. They linger, waiting for the moment when vigilance slips and terror can return. Eli Mercer survived, yes, but survival had come at a cost. The man in the truck bed, the trash bags, the relentless stalking, they had changed him. He had learned what it meant to be watched, to be hunted, and to know that ordinary life could collapse into horror at any moment. Even now, years later, every car in a parking lot, every shadow in a storm carries the weight of that night. And he knows, deep down, that the terror might not be finished. Some people, some horrors, never truly leave. Because the worst part of survival isn't the attack itself, it's the knowledge that someone else controls the fear. Someone else decides when it strikes, when it escalates, and whether it ends at all. Eli lives with that knowledge every day, a constant gnawing reminder that the world can shift from ordinary to horrifying in a single heartbeat. And every night, when the wind rustles the trees or rain hammers a window, he feels it again. The presence of something watching, waiting, and capable of returning when he least expects it.